Hi, I'm Chris with Sanderson Test Prep, and we're back to lesson 2 of our game app series, where we're going to introduce the appropriate way to provide a background, introduce a vehicle, and ultimately what we want to do is create a space game, kind of like this one. So this is a game that I made where we have a little jet traveling through space, dodging obstacles, and we're going to create a similar type of game where we can keep score, add points for collecting rewards, subtract points for getting hit by obstacles, as we can see here. So let's take a look now at an introduction to sprites. And if you watched our background lesson, so you already probably have a brief introduction to sprites, because here what we see with our backgrounds, if we want a fancy background, so if you remember in the last lesson, for drawing a background, you can simply pull in background and select a pre-existing color. But if you want a background like we have here with an image that we created from an animation, that animation really is being introduced as a sprite. It's an object that is going to appear somewhere on our screen. In this case, it's a background, so it covers the entire screen. And the way that we introduced that background was we had to establish it as a variable and create that sprite, meaning create that image. And then we had to align that image. So we had to set that image equal to a corresponding animation. And in this case, this animation doesn't have any additional frames. It's just the one still shot. We will a little bit later on show ways that we can introduce animation. So if you have, for example, a character in a game who's supposed to be running, the character might have different arm positions or leg positions as it moves across the screen. But for right now, our background that we introduced is just a static background that has just this one frame, this one image. And then we had to use the draw sprites function in order to actually draw it onto the screen. When you hit run, we see a background on the screen. Now let's see if we can introduce some object onto the screen. And in this case, we'll do, looks like we have a lot of space up in the sky here, so maybe we'll introduce an airplane or jet or helicopter or something like this as our next object to see the way that sprites can get introduced to their environment. So let's click on New Animation. And here we can click on Vehicles and select any vehicle that we want, but for this particular demonstration, I'll select maybe one of these airplanes. Let's try this red one. And like I mentioned, I think that it is helpful. Here it says plane red 1_1, and you have to worry about the underscores and the capitalization and so forth. I do recommend naming something with as straightforward and basic a name as you can when you're first getting introduced to it, just so it makes entering it into your code a little bit easier. So we have a plane here. And let's go back over to our code. We're going to introduce that airplane the same way that we introduced our background. So this is just a good recap of where we can find these different pieces of these blocks, which are going to look like this in text. And I do recommend getting comfortable typing out the text on your own and then also utilizing the blocks. So if you're a little bit more of a beginner, the blocks can be a really helpful guide, and this video series is really intended for beginners. But if you want to challenge yourself a little bit, you can create it as text, and then you can, within like the text, get used to actually typing in the code. And sometimes that's a really helpful way to learn about the different kinds of programming functionalities in more detailed fashion. So if you want to challenge yourself, you can look at it as text, but for right now, we're going to stick with the blocks. Let's see where we can get each of these. So remember, any object that we're introducing is called a sprite, and that's going to be here under this Sprites tab in the toolbox. And if you look, like I mentioned before, they don't always do it alphabetically. They actually do organize these practically where the most commonly used blocks that you'll need are going to be right at the top. So here we're going to pull this over, and the variable that we're introducing now is, we called it plane. So we're going to create it just like we did for the road, and then we have to set animation. That's our next block that we'll need to use. So we have the plane, and when you go to set animation, it'll allow you to select from a drop-down menu of all your different animations. So we're going to select the animation for the plane. In the draw sprites function, if I hit run right now, I just see the background. I don't see the plane there. And that's because the draw function is up here. We want that to be down below. So after we have introduced our variable for the road and then set that animation, after we have introduced our variable for the plane and then set that animation, that's when we want to draw everything. And if we click on run, we can see now that we have an airplane on the screen. Okay, so let's see if there's a way that we can move this around a little bit. So in our first lesson, I mentioned briefly that these numbers here, the 200, 200, that's going to set your object right for the very middle of the screen, which we can see here. And if you scroll your mouse around, if you look under the reset button below the screen where it says show grid, below that it will show you your X and Y coordinates for where the cursor of the mouse is. So right now the mouse is in the very middle, and you can see where the X's and Y's are on the screen. And basically the screen that you're looking at in Game Lab, this is a 400 pixel by 400 pixel screen. So at the very top left would be 0, 0, and then as you go across, X goes all the way from 0 to 400, and as you go down, Y goes from 0 to 400. So if you want an object to be on a certain part of the screen, a helpful way to do that is scroll your mouse over to where you would like it to be. So maybe we want our airplane to start out over here in this top left corner, and you can see the approximate X and Y values. Here we have 70 and 88. So you can use that as a guide for where you want to place an object. Let's try 75 and 75. And let's just see what that looks like if we were to run our program. So now our airplane is up there. So that looks like a good starting point. Maybe if you had a game where an airplane is flying across the screen, maybe you could even have obstacles or objects, clouds or maybe birds or something like that that your plane has to avoid. So that looks like a good starting point. Maybe we want it down a little bit further. Maybe I want to start it over here. It looks like that Y value would be around 150. So maybe I can try making that adjustment to these numbers here. Let's try, instead of 75, 150. Let's see what that would look like. Okay, so now my airplane's still over towards the left, but a little bit lower down from that top left corner. That looks about right, so I think I'll keep it there. So now we have the ability to introduce a background, whether we want a simple color or whether we want a cool image. We can introduce any background that we like, and we can introduce additional objects that are going to be able to navigate around the screen and interact with each other. And those object movements and interactions are exactly what we will explore in our next video. Thanks for watching.